Respectfully acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded, ancestral, and traditional lands of the Kawalapuya, Clatsani, Cowlitz, Chinook, Multnomah, and Clackamas peoples. With that being said, I'd like to welcome everybody to Habitat for Hope. Habitat for Hope is a living installation that embodies my fears and concerns, but also my cares and devotions. This place reflects the larger world around us, as well as my own growing evolution within it. It's influenced by artists who work with the land, social issues, phenomena, and landscape, and also contextually driven by a contemporary crisis that I've come to discover through various authors and journalists. It offers an unadulterated view of the global catastrophe of climate change by distilling down what I believe to be some of the major tumors of a healthy climate into a more approachable size. This piece is simultaneously supposing a more hopeful future that not only doesn't overwhelmingly run on carbon and protects and preserves its natural resources, but also develops a greater sense of care and enjoyment for the non-human species of the planet. By cultivating plants of the Pacific Northwest and juxtaposing them up against extractive practices, I am creating a place where profit, pollution, and destruction fade into the past, while care, stewardship, and life usurp the status quo. The garden site offers a gentle environment to take that all into consideration. The formal symmetry of the overall design operates as a sort of meanderable mandala, focused around a central location to look out of and center yourself within. Habitat for Hope offers atrocities within its atmosphere, but its borders will always be breached by the light and the life that it gives. And when creating this project, I was looking at many different artists, perhaps most relevant of which are Olafur Eliasson, Hans Hakke, and Nancy Holt. Specifically, Olafur Eliasson's Ice Watch, Hans Hakke's rainwater purification plant, and Nancy Holt's sun tunnels. I was particularly drawn to the elements in Eliasson and Hakke's work for their acknowledgement of a dilemma in need of more consideration, but also the ingenuity of their execution. On the occasion of the UN Climate Conference, COP21, Eliasson brought the reality of the disappearing ice sheets into the immediate vicinity of the viewer. By showcasing 12 melted hunks of the Iceland ice sheets and arranging them in a clock formation at the Place du Panthéon in Paris, he's taking the reality of a global phenomena happening outside of immediate viewing and putting it on display to further public care and consideration. It's simple, but it's simply profound. Similarly, Hakke called attention to the improper disposal of industrial and household waste that resulted in a local river's pollution. And by designing a laboratory-like filtration system that fed a tank of goldfish within the gallery, he is at once acknowledging the issue and offering a solution based around stewardship. Also of noteworthy inspiration is Hakke's evolution from a more local consideration to the kind of grander scale operations of the capitalistic system in general. I also adored Holt's acknowledgement of a much more celestial event, in this case sunrise and sunset, that connected the viewer to a much more primordial happening. Placed in the vastness of the Utah desert, it is outside of urban concern and at once celestial yet grounded, and reliant on the consciousness of the viewer to be inside of the installation, all of which helps foster a greater sense of care for the more spiritual qualities within us all. I thought it was important to add these qualities to my own work, and as we move through this installation, you'll notice their inspiration abound. But I'd also like to acknowledge a few authors who taught me more about the intricacies of climate change, and in turn helped me decide how I wanted to portray it in my own work. Naomi Klein's Capitalism vs. the Climate became my foundational research, which opened the door to how our societal behavior not only began this problem, but acts as a roadblock to any timely mitigation. Her book led me to discover other authors such as Christian Parenti, who in his book The Tropic of Chaos outlines how Cold War-era militarism and neoliberal capitalism all inhibit society's ability to avoid violent dislocations and proper mitigation efforts as climate change works to augment both the aforementioned pathologies. These artists and authors alike gave me a framework to operate in to figure out how I wanted to portray this issue. And first, I'd like to mention that the construction of this site uses, wherever possible, recycled or repurposed materials. And this was important to me, so I was generating as little trash as possible, but also not economically stimulating these larger department stores whenever I could. The beds that you see here are made from recycled doors. The grid that the honeysuckle will grow over uses recycled electrical wire. But you'll also notice that there's new lumber, and the pebbles that I had to make the floor of, I had to buy new. And this highlights an important factor. At some point or another, your world will come into contact with a version of extraction. It's inescapable, and it's represented by the chains that you see here on the chair. And this is important to acknowledge so decisions become conscious instead of impulsive. And as for the overall design, I think the term meanderable mandala sums up quite well the aesthetics, but also the kind of latent spiritual qualities within. It has a rigid rectilinear symmetry, but it's also broken up by these more kind of curvilinear moments. And for me, rectangles are a very kind of constructed man-made element, while circles are much more kind of soft and harmonious. And so by putting these two together, I'm suggesting a built and designed structure, but with stewardship at the forefront of concern. And moving into the garden, the first thing that we notice is the propane tank bird bath. So for this, I cut the bottom off of a propane tank and just lined it with a little bit of acrylic resin to make sure it didn't rust, and then filled it with a little bit of soil and water. And it's here that I began juxtaposing the biological and the built world. Whereas once this propane tank was contributing to destruction, it's now been reimagined and providing life for all of the creatures of the garden. And it's surrounded by common rush and sluice sedge, which are native plants of the Pacific Northwest, which is the case for all the plants here. That was an important element to introduce because it acknowledges a focus on ecology that tries to promote a healthier ecosystem. And moving over, we notice that there's these coastal strawberry plants and a little leaf miner's lettuce, all of which are mat plants, which will eventually kind of grow out and fill in this bed here. I've also included a squirrel trough up here and a bird trough here to attract as many residents to the garden as I could. Below this, we notice the snowberry growing out of its computer counterpart and surrounded by these western columbines here. But also here we notice that there's the kind of also ever-watching security cameras, which are kind of an important element hinting at the dangers of the more ominous future of surveillance capitalism, in which our personal information and data will be extracted and mined just as our natural resources are today. And just behind this bed, you'll notice a very healthy gooseberry plant growing out of a repurposed Wi-Fi router and accompanied with the similar security cameras. And this begins a dialogue between these two beds and also helps to kind of further that metaphor of the hidden dangers of surveillance capitalism. If you notice, the outside of this gooseberry plant is very soft and green and lush, but just underneath it are these very violent and dangerous thorns, all acting as a sort of metaphor for the kind of hidden dangers of surveillance capitalism. And just behind this, we notice these five objects here that represent grain silos and have Salal and Mahonia nervosa growing out of them. And they're kind of representatory of industrial ag in general, which was a very important element to include for me because this is kind of where my ecological awareness began. I was looking specifically at the meat industry and quickly realized that it was kind of diametrically opposed to some of my core values. I had tried vegetarianism a few times before, but for reasons that I can never fully latch onto, like personal health. But realizing that it was in complete opposition to sustainability, and by my consumption of it, I was contributing to that, well, vegetarianism had never seemed more palatable. Moving just beyond this, we notice that there's a huckleberry plant, more mat plants, the little leaf miner's lettuce, and creeping phlox as well, wildflowers and ferns, which will all eventually kind of fill in this whole bed area here. I've also included this water wheel to kind of hint towards that much needed transition into a renewable energy system, which is also seen with the wind structure here and the solar panel that powers the fountain. For the water wheel itself, I made a concrete cast out of an old lampshade and attached an acrylic tube to the bottom of it to release the water. And as for the wheel itself, I tried on multiple occasions to 3D print the necessary pieces, but to no avail. I eventually just took the two best side pieces and then slapped little pieces of aluminum to fill in the gaps. As for the structure itself, I just found an old scrap metal and welded the pieces together to kind of hold everything in place. And as you'll see, we have water power. For the wind structure, I just used old spoons and cut the tail ends of them off and bent the tips so I could epoxy them to skateboard bearings and then attach them to this pole so they can dance in the wind. And these were imperative elements to include, seeing as how they're kind of our best solutions so far to drastically reducing our carbon addiction. And in a project kind of solely based around extraction and by nature carbon release, I thought it was important to include our best solution so far. And as we leave this side of the garden, we pass by the centerpiece, which is an area designed with the viewer in mind. I made this little tabletop here out of scrap pieces of wood, built the floor out of recycled Christmas tree rounds, and constructed the wall that you see here out of repurposed wooden dowels. And with the tables and chairs being enclosed in this circular design, it lets the viewer feel like they're kind of within and a part of this environment, as opposed to being outside of it. And this is really where the magic happens. As one sits here with their morning coffee, afternoon read, or nightcap, you begin to develop a connection between yourself and the plant and animal life within. You begin to hear their wants and needs, either by a wilting plant in need of more water or a squirrel who's looking for more snacks because there's no more left. And by tending to these wants and needs, you begin to develop a connection between yourself and the non-human inhabitants of this environment. And just beyond this, we notice that there's a second half of the propane tank. And whereas the one in the first bed was used to provide life for all the animal species, this one has been reimagined as a housing unit for a western tiger lily. The western tiger lily will grow up towards the light and reach out to meet up with the surrounding great camas. And just beyond that, we notice that there's a pipeline under construction and surrounded by a military presence. And this is a stand-in for pipeline construction in general, but more specifically inspired by Line 3. Line 3, of course, is the tar sands oil pipeline that is ripping through the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe in northern Minnesota and is probably one of the most egregious extractive projects currently underway, at least locally. At Line 3, there's been a complete dismissal of Indigenous and locals' cares, concerns, and values, as well as countless acts of violence and hundreds of arrests made at a very pugnacious and irreverent security force, both private and public, which has kind of become the new norm in fossil fuel protection. This very heavy-handed militaristic approach towards those merely concerned with protecting the environment and its natural resources. Which brings us to the oil rig fountain. For the fountain itself, I just took scrap pieces of metal and welded them together in the structure, and then rusted it to kind of give it this old-timey feel. And just underneath the structure, there's a 5-gallon bucket that houses a bunch of water that I've dyed black to kind of mimic that look of oil. And then very ironically placed a solar panel that powers the pump, which pumps the water up the tube, and it hits this little apparatus at the top to let the water fall back down the outside and go back into the housing tank. But here you'll also notice this overwhelming military presence. This is similarly a stand-in for fossil fuel protection, but it's also showcasing that a lot of these extractive sites themselves are becoming these kind of pseudo-military bases. In northern Mozambique, the French oil giant Total has called on the government of Mozambique to dispatch its military to kind of stomp out an insurgency that's reaching ever closer to one of their liquid natural gas sites, all of which has kind of created this war zone-like environment. And so not only does this over-militarized approach have drastic social implications for anyone living near these extractive sites, but it's also spurred a very unhealthy and unwarranted threat to critical infrastructure by those merely wanting to protect the earth, its inhabitants, and its natural resources. Although here, we notice that there's this arm of the sword firm just breaching over the border and penetrating through a seemingly impenetrable force, suggesting here that life will begin to take back over as this extraction project fades into the past. And just behind this, we notice similar grain silos as the neighboring bed, as well as similar mat plants arranged in the same fashion to kind of further that overall symmetry of this place. And just behind this, we have a skunk or a briefcase with an accompanied skunk cabbage. And this plant and object were very specifically placed together, as the briefcase has come to represent the carbon trading market, which has arguably made the environment worse, associated extractive industries all the more rich, and exasperated the existing humanitarian crisis while creating a few of its own as well. All of this might lead one to believe that carbon trading stinks, and as such, the skunk cabbage emulates that quite well. And it's here that we begin to notice the different types of storytelling that are taking place, where the oil rig and the soldiers kind of act as a tableau that tell a very specific story. The briefcase uses a symbolic language to describe its position, while the plant and the animal life are kind of a literal element for the transition of values that I think necessary. And moving just behind this bed, we'd come to this window. And this kind of gives the viewer a kind of viewfinder's perspective, and kind of showcases this environment from above. It lets the viewer see this habitat kind of in its totality. You at once notice all the kind of destruction and despair, but are overwhelmingly confronted by the life that is about. There's also a quote here by Martin Luther King Jr., which kind of acts as a call of duty for the type of transition that I think is necessary. And it states, "We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift away from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." And as we move outside of the garden, we travel over this path that I've constructed just out of found bricks and stones that I acquired through the construction of the actual site, and we come to the vegetable bed. And this was an important element to include for me because aside from kind of the mental benefits and stimulation that one can get from growing ferns, shrubs, wildflowers, and such, gardens can also be a physical source of fuel. And I think mental health and physical health kind of go hand in hand, and eating healthier food is a great way to start practicing both. And just behind the vegetable bed, we notice this kind of much more calm environment that you kind of come upon as you leave the garden. And this area was designed much more by the tranquility of the forest, as opposed to kind of the more realities of society. This fence and bush here help keep this area really damp and cool year-round, and it's been accompanied with plants that do well in those conditions. There's an oval leaf mitrewort, club moss, wood rush, common rush, 3 different types of ferns, all accompanied by these 3 moss logs and detritus kind of sprinkled over the floor to mimic that forest floor setting. I've also included here a carved stone that holds a little bit of water to kind of act as a watering hole for all the residents of the garden. And that's kind of an overview of this microcosm in general, but I'd like to head back in for a minute and pull out a few elements and look at them in closer detail. First, I'd like to mention the spiderweb. It at once provides a soft barrier between the sidewalk and the more calm garden, but it also helps break up the rigid structure of the kind of overall design. And metaphorically, the sticky nature of the web helps tie all these elements together. It shows that none of these elements occur in a vacuum. They're interdependent and affect each other accordingly, all creating this kind of hyper-object of global warming that we are currently living with. But it was also important to me that this piece have an audience of all. I wanted it to be for anyone and have something for everyone. And I thought using elements of humor would be a good way to obtain this. And I think the overall scale of the objects that you see here kind of contribute to that humorous quality, especially when seen butted up against the wildlife. For instance, if the birds or the squirrels are hanging out next to the security cameras or happen to jump over the security fence and hang out in the oil rig, the kind of small nature of the soldiers or the cameras compared to the grander nature of the birds or the squirrels themselves, and also their complete indifference of what these objects are or why they're here, is quite hilarious, and it's quite heartwarming as well. But there's also elements like this carved slate that sits in front of the bird bath, which has the Organ petition laser engraved on it. This is a petition sent out by the Heartland Institute calling for the U.S. government to reject the global warming agreement set up in Kyoto, Japan. It also makes the claim that increased atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide are actually extremely good for the planet and help augment the plant and animal life within. And it's very obvious to find the humor in the audacity of that statement, but I wanted the viewer to be able to look into that a little bit further if they chose. So I put together this research paper that outlines in detail elements of extractivist culture and associated responses, as well as a kind of a social and environmental analysis of renewable energy. And here one can learn all about the Kyoto Protocol, or Al Gore's abomination of it by setting up the carbon trading market and spurring a wave of green capitalists that we're still living with today. Or what solar panels really cost through extraction, production, and implementation. And this research paper was important for me to kind of better understand climate change and how I wanted to portray it in my own work. But it also turned into this kind of thorough analysis of some of the fallacies of clean energy. For instance, if you notice the coal train coming from the solar panel, it's because it takes a ton of coal, pet coke, met coke, hardwood chips, charcoal, and quartz, all to produce the metallurgical grade silicone that's used for solar production. And that's merely the first step in a very long, lengthy, toxic process. And through all this research, I've kind of come to the conclusion that energy is just not clean. There really isn't a version of it that is. And assuming so kind of furthers this culture of disavow. Also, our consumption crisis and infatuation with economic growth will continuously hinder progressive steps taken forward to combat climate change. suggesting that we have a societal problem just as big as our atmospheric one. And so with all this kind of heavier content, I wanted to include as many elements of natural beauty as I could. And of course, the plants were my best friend in that regard. So I also wanted to include some more spiritual elements, because this piece has had a very spiritual effect on me. To do this, I created a sacred geometry design that you see above the table that uses red, yellow, and blue nylon thread and sunlight to create these very subtle color mixing moments that change with the position of the sun and the position of the viewer in the garden. There's also a glass prism that kind of dances in the wind and constantly showcases the kind of mysteries of the light spectrum. And to foster a greater sense of care for the plant species of this garden, I've created a field guide that has fun kind of histories and fun facts about the plants in here, but also tips for growing and tending to them. And I've gotten to take on so many different roles with this project, and I think it serves a multitude of purposes for that reason. I was the laborer who toiled the land, the designer of the physical attributes, the curator of the accompanying plant life, the researcher behind the paper, and the maker of all the objects that you see within. And this piece then kind of all at once becomes educational, experiential, social, cultural, political, philosophical, and spiritual. And through all these different roles, I've developed such an emotional attachment to this place and its non-human inhabitants. And I see this environment as kind of a tic-tac of the larger world around us, all of which has developed this kind of newfound connection between myself and the Earth. I can't really just see it as this floating planet in space anymore, although I still do, and that's plenty neat. But before that, it's a home. It's our home. And it's a place that needs to be cared for, so it can care for us. Which is why I find so much respite in this place that I've built. Because here, there are plenty of atrocities happening within this atmosphere. But at least here, the light breaches the borders, the plants dance in the wind, the squirrels bury their lunch, the birds look for snacks, and life begins to take back over. But none of this will happen without trying. And I'd like to finish you guys off with a quote by Shoshana Zuboff that I think sums that up quite well. "There is no end of history. Each generation must assert its will and imagination as new threats require us to try the case in every age." Thank you.